So as always, I would just first of all like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we're coming in from today's meeting, that we are all residing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And I want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. And also want to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are also joining us today, and also any non-Indigenous members. So welcome once again to the Taking Care of Disability Business webinars. So today being the 3rd of June, I'm not sure if some people are aware, but today is actually Eddie Mabo Day, which obviously culminates the Reconciliation Week. It concludes today's the last day of Reconciliation Week, but also, you know, we commemorate the work that Eddie Mabo did. So today is actually the 28th anniversary of the High Court ruling, which has set a precedent for native title for our First Nations people here in Australia. With that being said, though, there's still a lot of unfinished business, I believe, that still needs to take place. And you can only look at the current social climate to realise that, you know, it highlights the importance of reconciliation. Now, you know, obviously, it's all over the headlines at the moment with, you know, the African-American bloke, George Floyd, who unfortunately passed away. You know, while he was being arrested by police over in America. And that sort of sent shockwaves around the world, where we're seeing demonstrations across the globe, basically acknowledging that there needs to be change for social justice in the world. And, you know, places even from Paris to Belgium, even Syria and wartime place, there's actually a commemoration where someone's painted a mural with the words "I can't breathe," and a mural of George Floyd's picture next to those words, which is pretty I guess profound, considering that this mural is on what is the remains of a wall, the only remains of a wall of a building that was blown up by bombs. So, you know, with all of that, the sentiment for First Nations people is that, well, we have cases of George Floyd of our own. And in fact, you know, in line with reconciliation, since, you know, these webinars are targeted around, you know, information around the Royal Commission into disability, you know, the abuse, exploitation and neglect of those people with disability. But there's also a Royal Commission that took place in 1991, and that was the Royal Commission into Black deaths in custody. And since then, there have been 432 cases of Aboriginal people dying in custody, and with nobody being charged for those deaths. And in a lot of instances, we would argue that the circumstances could be that of murder. So, you know, for a lot of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in this country, you know, we experience racism, we experience discrimination, and particularly those people who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and also live with a disability. You know, there's the concept of double disadvantage. I can speak to my own experience as an Aboriginal person. My first memory of racism was when I was 7 years old at a public swimming pool, and a white man lost his wallet in the dressing room, and I'd come out of the stall, and he'd grab me and he'd accuse me of stealing his wallet, which then led to the police detaining me without an adult present for 3 hours. And when they let me go, I had to walk 4 kilometres to get home because I didn't have any other way of getting home. And so that's my first memory of racism in this country. And like many people that are of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, they've all got their own stories, and that's just one of many. My first memory of, I guess, seeing somebody being discriminated because they had a disability was when I was in primary school, and I remember someone mocking a person who was deaf, and my response to that, because I knew it was wrong, but My response to that was I just went and hit this kid in the head, because I basically stood up for this fella and I said, you can't do that. And obviously I got in trouble. My mum sort of, she didn't agree with my methods, but she did reassure me that, hey, look, when you see stuff like that happen, you do have to stand up. And which leads me to where I am now. I have the incredible privilege of being able to work with First Peoples Disability Network, who, as we all know, is the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living with disability in this country. And we fight for systemic change for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living with disability. And, you know, just in line with what I've just said, I want to acknowledge our founder, who's Uncle Lester Bostock, who was a Bundjalung man living with a disability, who was at the forefront of promoting and protecting the human rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability in Australia for his whole life. He lived with a disability himself, and he was the first person to publicly introduce the concept of double disadvantage when he gave a speech in 1991. He's also widely recognised as one of the pioneers of Aboriginal media in Australia, and he can actually be credited to the disclaimer that we now see for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers when they're viewing something on TV, where you know that disclaimer that says that you may be watching something with deceased Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You know, as he was, I guess, as acclaimed as he was humble, he also received the NAIDOC Elder of the Year in 2010 and was awarded an honorary doctorate in 2016 by the Australian Film of Television and Radio School in 2016, just before his passing in 2017. So, you know, there's people like Uncle Lester and also many others that go unnamed that I just wanted to take the time to acknowledge before we started today. And I thought it was just really important to do so, being Eddie Mabo Day and also Reconciliation Week. And which now I would like to segue to Uncle Paul Calcott, who works with FPDN. And he was also one of these people that continually continue to fight for the rights of Aboriginal people with disability and also equality in general. So, you know, Reconciliation Week, you know, I also just want to acknowledge all of our non-Indigenous people that are coming in and joining us today. And I will also want to acknowledge that, you know, your contribution to reconciliation is very important as well. And that it's not a black and white thing. It's very much a everybody against inequality thing. So without saying any more, I just want to hand over to Uncle Paul Calcott, who's going to talk to us about some of the work that he's done for the Disability Royal Commission. So thank you, Uncle Paul.
Thanks, Tori. Thanks very much for that. Hi, everyone. I probably should give you a bit of a rundown on myself. I'm a Wiradjuri man from central New South Wales, but I now live up on Kabi Jinnaburra country on the beautiful Sunshine Coast and in Queensland. I contracted polio as a young kid, and I remember my father, when he was really ill, told me that I'd never realised this, but back in the day, he was very fearful of having a fair-skinned son with a disability because I might have been taken away, because this was back in the early 60s, late 1950s. He actually had some of his brothers were removed by welfare purely because they thought his mother had too many kids at the time. So we have a history of stolen generation within our own family, and so I'm quite passionate about disabilities and supporting our mob with disabilities, because I've grown up with disability all my life, and I've been now working in the area for probably close to 40 years, and the last 15 years specifically around our mob, First Nations people with disabilities. So what I want to talk to today is a bit of an intro into the work I do with the First Peoples Disability Network. I have a great job. I'm the National Training and Resource Development Manager. So what we do is we develop resources and promotional materials that are culturally engaging for our communities. What we discovered when we first started doing this was a lot of the resources were incredibly text heavy. They were very anglicised, they were very based around the Anglo-Australian model of supports and engagement. And even though our community are pretty cluey and very educated and in the long run, you know, could work out things, it wasn't engaging, it wasn't respectful. And also the sheer fact that a lot of these resources were aimed at people with cognitive impairments, we thought, well, a lot of people can't even understand it, the people they've got it targeted at. So what we do is that we went around and started to interpret and translate a lot of these resources using the traditional way that our ancestors communicated and shared stories. We're not a written culture. All our culture is around, we're an oral culture. We tell stories, we pass down stories, and in doing that, we've used the same symbols that have been used for thousands and thousands of years. And, you know, we don't have a written language, but if we did, that would be the closest thing to it, would be all the symbols that we use to tell stories. So we started to look at doing that way, translating it back into ways that was respectful to our community and ways that people would feel engaged and feel like this is for us. And also, you know, a lot of the communities we worked in, English is not their first language. You know, if you, in mainstream Australia, if you spoke 6 or 7 languages, you'd be considered a genius. In a lot of our communities, that's just general. That's just how it is. And English isn't always the first language. So we thought, well, to be more respectful too, we need to sort of get rid of that side of it and start communicating in a way that goes across lots of different communication styles. A person with a cognitive impairment could understand what was going on, and they would be able to be engaged in it as well. We also want to get rid of a lot of the stereotypical images that are used in a lot of resources that they use to represent Australia's First People. As you can see, we come in many different shades these days, and we feel that our connection to our culture is nothing to do with the colour of our skin. It's connection to our saltwater dreaming, our freshwater dreaming, our country, our ancestors, and our spirituality to this country. This is how we connect, and this is how we connect with each other. So we want to incorporate that in all the resources that we developed as well. How we go about that too is that we're not keyboard warriors. We're not just sitting in an office or we might not just buy a painting that we think looks nice and use it as a background for everything. We've spent a lot of time, I travel with our colleagues to remote areas of the Northern Territory, Queensland, New South Wales. When we first started developing our resources and we wanted to make sure we were on the right track, we spoke to, on one occasion, I think with in Tennant Creek, we spoke with elders in Tennant Creek and community there, the language centre. We went out to Utopia and had the massive privilege of sitting down with elders and even some lawmen there and showing it to them and saying, is this respectful? Do you understand what we're doing? And they were really appreciative that someone was taking the time to actually help talk about disabilities in our communities and help people to start thinking about it, starting the conversation and how to start looking at services and supports. So we got a really great response. We travelled through Far North Queensland. I remember in Mount Isa sitting down with a group of elders, aunties, painting and having like a long conversation just to talk about disability and what it looked like and what it was. And we had all the prototypes of our artwork, the first drafts. I remember the artists took them all. They loved them. They took the whole lot to take them home to show their kids. And I think that was, to me, that was a huge thumbs up that they did that. We spent time up in the Torres Strait. We showed our resources at one stage to a group of young mums who cared for their kids with disabilities. And I was quite overwhelmed with the response because this is just what we do at First Peoples Disability Network. We don't think, we're particular rocket scientists. This is just how things should be. But a couple of the mums actually become quite emotional and started crying and said, this is the first time someone's bothered to sit down and take the time to be respectful and talk to us about disabilities and how it might look for us and our communities. So that was a huge honour and very humbling to think that something we've developed had such an impact on people. We spent a lot of time on Palm Island. I remember on Palm Island sitting with the art group there that we have a really good relationship with, and looking at ways to depict country and saltwater dreaming and freshwater dreaming, and just making sure that, this is a universal thing. Or, sometimes we can't do something that's universal because there's hundreds of language groups, but we try our best to get things that people understand. And our mob is really understanding. Like sometimes we've come across the symbol and they say, what's that? And when we say what it is, they say, fine, now we know it. Now we know your way and our way. So it's a really great thing to be able to communicate with people along these lines and develop these resources. And also we have an elder group attached to FPDN, and that stands for Elders Living with Disabilities Australia, ELDA, Elders. And they're like our Brains Trust. And we have representation in that group from multiple language groups. It's like our mini United Nations. And we have representation there, Torres Strait Island community, Western Yulanji, Kukulanji, Jabagai, Yordle Yordle, Durable, Pinanjara, Wiradjuri, Palawa, Dharawal, and Kabi Kabi here. And I don't think I've missed anyone, but so we have a huge Brains Trust of people that help us to develop this. And then I have the massive honour and privilege and responsibility of then painting the artwork and turning all this information into a form of resource that people can understand, and we can sit there and explain things to people. So the example we're going to show now is something we just did for the Royal Commission. So we're approached to say, how can we depict what the Royal Commission does and what it's about that will help it engage with our communities? Because again, their resources are all very text heavy and fact sheets, and it doesn't always work with our mob. Even though, you know, our members might speak 5 or 6 languages, English isn't their first one, so therefore not always people aren't always very proficient in writing English. So we did this, I did this artwork, which, you know, under my role after talking to a lot of people, and it actually depicts the elders coming together, the Royal Commissioners coming together, and to translate their role in community and why they're important, we use the symbol representing an elder. Now, we're not saying that they're elders in our community, but we're representing them as elders and respected and learned people within their community. And that's why they were chosen to take on this role in the Royal Commission. We also developed a symbol too, because there are no word for disability in our language. We have some, in my language, there are some words that talk about injury and sort of not permanency, but injury in the way you may walking with a limp and so forth. But there's no actual word for it. So we took the shape, which is the U shape, which you'll see in the artwork. The U shape is used extensively to represent a person in traditional art, because that's the shape you leave in the sand after sitting down having a yarn. So to represent a person with a disability, we made one side a little shorter. So what that says is that if you are a person with a disability, you may leave a different shape in the sand to other people. It doesn't say worse or better, it's just different, a different shape, so you may need some different supports. Also, you'll notice in the artwork, the way we depict an elder or a respected person, where we had to translate the commissioners into our language, was it's a U shape with another U shape inside it. And that represents someone having knowledge and sharing that knowledge and nurturing somebody else. And you also see that 2 of the representations we've used for the commissioners, they're shorter on one side. And that's representing that 2 of the commissioners are people living with a disability themselves. So that's how we depicted that. When we had to talk about how they're going to travel through country and collect these stories, we used the translation of a message stick for that. So that it shows these commissioners then travelling through country with a message stick collecting stories. And we know that they're not physically and literally going to have a message stick, but it's the way we tell the story, the way that we translate what they're doing. Maybe we could develop a message stick. How good would that be for them to carry one through country anyway? So, and then the other part we've used to depict the part of the Royal Commission is that in the centre you'll see there's 3 circles. Those 3 circles represent the 3 years that the Commission will run for. And within that, we've used ways that people can come together and tell their story. So we've depicted, for instance, the formal hearings or coming along and getting information off the Royal Commissioners directly. We've shown that you can come together in a casual yarning circle with community groups and family members to share your stories. We've also shown a way that just one-on-one, that if you feel you could only tell your story to one person, we've depicted that as well with the 2 U shapes coming together. And we've put shields either side, and the shields represent that that's a safe place to come together and tell their story. The background to the artwork represents the different colours for saltwater dreaming, freshwater dreaming, desert dreaming, and urban dreaming. So we've used those colours to depict that. And I just want to say too, because it is Mabo Day, that Auntie Benita Mabo was an amazing mentor and friend. And she taught me, and I've always included it, to always include saltwater dreaming and saltwater aspect of all the artwork I do when telling stories. So the blue representation there with the circles all connected is all our saltwater communities and islander communities coming together in connection there. So that's just an example how, you know, elders have had a huge influence on how we depict these stories and put the artwork out there. So I won't waffle on too much because I'd like to show you the video that we've done. Because what we do is after we develop this artwork, we deconstruct it and we create a narration to go along with it, and then we can actually show it to people and we tell the story. So we animate the artwork so people can sit down and listen to it and tell the story. And we do that in a male voice and female voice to try and respect women's business and men's business. And in some cases, when we've been able to do it, we've been able to translate it back into language. So, but in this case, I don't know which version you'll hear this time. But yeah, so it's a great way just to communicate with people. It's a respectful way. We've had really good feedback. We learn all the time. We take on board all the feedback that we get, and this is just you know, I think it's a great resource. A lot of people have supported. I just had the huge honour of actually painting it, putting it together, and being the conduit for all the information that we've collected over the years and within FPDN. So I'll hand it back to you, Tori, if you want to show the video.
Yep, here we go.
The Disability Royal Commission is an opportunity for people with disability and elders who might have experienced abuse, neglect, violence or exploitation during their life to tell their story and be respectfully listened to. The Royal Commission is made up of 7 people who are elders and respected members of their own communities. It has representatives from different community groups including Australia's First People, people living with disability and the LGBTIQ+ community. These people have come together to start what we might call a message stick so they can begin to collect all these stories. Over the next 3 years, they will take the message stick and start gathering stories from people with disability and elders who feel that they have not been treated right by service providers and workers, or maybe even community or family members. If you feel you would like to tell your story, you could either come along to a formal hearing, or if you feel more comfortable, to a casual yarning circle. If you feel a bit worried or scared to tell your story, it can be arranged for you to tell your story with only 1 or 2 people in a safe place, and your name will be kept secret, or you can even tell it over the phone. If you think you might need some legal help before telling your story, this can also be arranged for you. The Royal Commission will try to hear all these stories by travelling across the land, visiting as many regions and communities as possible over the 3 years. At the end of the 3 years, they will take these stories that have been entrusted to them and present them to a group of government representatives. These representatives will use the information from all these stories to make changes to make sure people with disabilities and elders are cared for, supported and respected in the future. After all this, the Royal Commission elders will then go back to their communities. However, the First Peoples Disability Network will continue yarning with many of them around disability business. If you would like information on how you or someone you know can tell your story, you can contact Your Story Disability Legal Support on 1800 771 800 or call the Royal Commission on 1800 517 199 or go to the First Peoples Disability website at www.fpdn.org.au. So yeah, that's it. I might just point out too what we I didn't talk about, and it's in the artwork there. And unfortunately, I think the subtitles were out of screen. But we also used some artwork to give examples of abuse, neglect, violence, and exploitation that we tried to make relevant to communities. So, for example, the example that we've given in the artwork to look at neglect is that we have a group of people sitting around, the symbols for people sitting around coolamon baskets. Now, coolamon baskets are a traditional way of carrying food and used to carry children in them. These people are sitting around these coolamon baskets full of food and berries. But on the outside is an elder sitting on their own. And what that talks about is the person not being included in community, not getting enough to eat, and being neglected and just left to one side. So we've used the artwork to even use examples of exploitation, abuse, neglect, and violence. And we've developed some other resources that also go into more detail into these examples as well in storytelling. So back to you, Tori.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. Yeah, so I think what we'll do now is we'll just allow a few minutes for people to ask any questions, if that's all right with you, just around, you know, what you've shared and the artwork. I'm also going to share the link for that video in the chat as well, if people wanted to review that later on. So please, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, and yeah, we'll have those answered for you. Paul, Justin Thomas sends his greetings. How are you doing? Long time no see.
G'day, Justin. How you going?
So I might just give a few more moments for any questions to come through. Uncle Paul Gwynlowes says, thank you, that was great. How can organisations such as NDIS providers do more to provide accessible content and resources?
Well, we work closely with the NDIS in regards to this. So, yeah, they are making the effort with us, and we have developed resources, and we will be doing some training around their community connectors to help them engage better with our community. So our mob aren't left out. But we have some resources on our webpage as well in regards to the NDIS and planning and that too. So we're getting there.
Yeah, nice one. Mitch McQueen comments, that was brilliant and very clear. Sarah Martins writes, or Sarah Martins, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Paul, do you do any proactive approach to tell a story you might know is worth it to share?
Sorry, what was that again?
Do you do any proactive approach to tell a story that you might know of is worth it to share?
So, we do a lot of stuff. If you look on our website, we translate a lot of things in the stories. We have different YouTube things happening as well. So we don't always wait till we're invited. We will develop stuff if we see a gap in that.
Yeah, nice. Reese Nagus, how you doing? Thanks for joining. Justin Thomas, there was an issue yesterday between police and an Aboriginal kid in front of my place. So yeah, I'm just conscious of time, everybody. Thanks again for sharing, Uncle Paul. We'll move on now, and if there are any questions, just feed them through, and we'll try and get a response for you. So our next panelist, oh, sorry, just one last question. What's a good way to start a consultation process with community to create culturally appropriate resources?
So I think the best thing is to develop a relationship with that community, find out who are the people, like if it's around disabilities, find out who the elders are and sit down and just have a conversation and say, this is what you would like to do and how will it look in there. So it's just a case of going in without guns blazing and saying, I've got all this. It's just sitting down and finding out how would this work, how would this look in your community and how can we help develop it.
Awesome, thanks Uncle Paul. So yeah, we'll hand over now to Julie Peters. Julie is working with TAFE New South Wales here on the Mid-North Coast, and she does a lot of work around community services and delivering training in that area. So yeah, Julie, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tori. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, Gumbaynggirr, and would also like to pay respect to elders both past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal people present today. I'd also like to thank First Peoples Disability Network for giving me this opportunity. I probably want to clarify, I'm not an expert on TAFE, but I've been working with TAFE for 7 years. Prior to that, I did about 25 to 30 years working in community services, so working in non-government agencies and certainly across the field. So probably my life experiences are more associated with just working with families and young people and looking at the different histories behind those as well. So, and I also want to acknowledge Reconciliation Week, and I sort of had a little bit of a think this week and went, what do people really know about reconciliation? I do teach across the state with Orange TAFE too around safety within the communities and work with lots of people throughout New South Wales. So for lots of people, there's not a great understanding within the white community about reconciliation. And I think that's where we really need to build on that and say that, really reconciliation is probably a time for all Australians to learn about shared histories and cultures and achievements and, and look at how we can action and participate in national reconciliation. I looked back too over the themes and one that always stood out for me was don't keep history a mystery. And I think one of the big things that I've found is sitting and listening to students or people within our communities around their history. And when I first moved to the Nambucca Valley, that was my job really, was to find out, what's the history within this area? Who are the people that I'm going to be teaching and working with, and what do I need to understand about their history and their lives? And then I looked at 2019 and sort of looked at what Walk Together with Courage. And I think, considering what's been happening in this last week where we still see such racism, such discrimination, that we really need to come together and walk with courage, take courage. And we are seeing people that are standing beside people in this really difficult time. And then this year we looked at In This Together. So 3 words that basically that were put together before we looked at the global crisis we've got now with COVID. And really, it does remind us that within the crisis, we need to come together and be all together. So hopefully it might take a little while. So what I did go back and look at with TAFE was some of the initiatives, some of the strategies that they'd put in place or had looked at developing to strengthen our relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And one of those is what they call RAP, which is Reconciliation Action Plan. And it looked at how we engage staff and everybody involved within our community, because it's not just about engaging people with disabilities or people from the Aboriginal community, it's about engaging everybody to be involved in it. And they looked at some of the ways we can actually make a culturally safe environment for everybody. So when I think of reconciliation too, I think it's about, because of our fears or our background or our history, we sometimes don't always feel that we're in a safe environment. So we need to be building on people's self-determination and looking at economic independence when we look at reconciliation as well. And so I think what TAFE was trying to say here was that we need to make a commitment to making reconciliation real, and that we are taking that action through TAFE New South Wales for the communities in which we work. I know within the Nambucca Valley we have a significantly high rate of young people and adults within our community who are Aboriginal, who have missed many opportunities for education. So for me, that's what I was seeing over 30 years of working in the industry, was that not only were they missing education through history, like not being able to attend school, not having the types of learning strategies in place to meet the needs. And if anybody ever gets a chance, as an organisation in Western Australia that put together a video called Swimming the River, and it talks about that incredibly insurmountable gap that people who are Aboriginal have to actually get over to actually come into what we would call mainstream learning that is really not meeting the needs of young people or anyone who is in our Aboriginal communities. And when we think about it, education is almost paramount to breaking down all the cycles of disadvantages in Aboriginal families and communities. And with that, we get a point of, you know, greater employment, you know, enhancing of people's self-development. And, you know, at the end of the day, it would hopefully reduce some of the social isolation too. So right now we're actually all teaching online, which has been really good learning experience for me, but I also understand there would be lots of students, and that's what I'm coming across, is students within my classes that I teach who don't have access to computers, don't have access to the internet as well as what they need to have. They're coming in via phones. It's a really difficult time. So what we need to be looking at is how can we minimise the difficulties they're having with online learning, and look at how we can actually embrace getting them back into that face-to-face teaching, because we find that's often some of the things that really work for people. So the other thing I want to talk about is actually LLN, or what we call literacy in language and numeracies. And what we have found that, you know, if I looked at statistics, it's about 7 million Australians don't have the reading skills and numeracy skills to actually get by in everyday life. And of that, there would be quite a high proportion of Aboriginal people in different communities or in isolated areas that would come under that. And we need to identify the gaps that are there and look at how we're going to implicate some of the educational workplace how we're going to get the learners back into participating in the classrooms or in an environment that's really good for them. So the LLN has got training packages that hopefully for us as facilitators and teachers need to be really concentrating on, and really looking at how we get best outcomes for the learners that are attending. Some of the other things that TAFE has in place is a strategic plan which prioritises things like creating jobs, looking at building infrastructures, boosting apprenticeships for young people who are Aboriginal, delivering really good resources and budgets that we can sort of work with. And the biggest one, and the one that I really find important to me, is protecting the most vulnerable people in our community. And we just saw how we really needed to be out and really making a point of some of the people in our community through COVID were going to be some of the most vulnerable people in our communities because of the history that people have been through and the trauma that they may have experienced. One of the other things I do teach is mental health at TAFE too. So I certainly have seen that we really concentrate in some of our packages around the trauma from the past and how that really impacts on people and students within our communities. What I will say that we do have TAFE Digital, which is an online type thing, and it is one of the largest online educational providers in Australia. So we have an Aboriginal units of support. We have an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Education Action Plan in place. And we have what we call CPALs, because what we looked at was particular areas that we needed to be concentrating on with young people and the older members of our community as well. And that was looking at their career progression. So looking at, where do they start? What's the journey they're going to take to get to where they want to go? And I think that's really important, that it should be their choices. It looks at Aboriginal languages. And I think, Tori, you made a point, well, no, actually it might have been Paul, that, English is not their first language quite often. So it's really important that we look at, if we're going to be providing services, we need to be meeting with elders in our community or talking to the older members of our community about the languages and the types of languages we should be using to engage, and also to make whatever we are teaching really understandable. And then we need to look at also their employability skills. So we have a really high rate of unemployment within this area. And I want to qualify that I've looked at this area and not others, but I'm sure there would be significantly high numbers of unemployed in different areas. We also have an Aboriginal engagement team, which is, also includes community engagement officers within our areas. So we have a person that goes from Kempsey to Maxville, where I actually teach at. And David's a great guy, and I love to catch up with him because he can sort of, assist me to actually provide the best possible facilitation of groups that I can have, and works to always having lots of involvement also out in the community, because that's who we should be listening to. What are the needs of the community? The people in the communities are the ones that tell us that. And it's sort of, again, we have a disability support section, and because this is based around, say, disabilities today, one of the biggest things that I saw, that we had many, many people with disabilities in our classes, and that includes people with mental health issues who needed lots of support to getting through the courses that they were using. We have many young people who might have fetal alcohol syndrome, and due to that, that causes things like, low memory rates, looking at bad coordination of, their behaviours can be more difficult because in their lack of understanding or lack of patience by others in putting those across. So with all the initiatives that Aboriginal students continue to be, they are still seen as the most disadvantaged students in the Australian education system. And I don't think that anybody would argue that. And I think what we need to be looking at is that early intervention. We need to be looking at children going to daycare and being prepared for what is the main areas that they're going to be facing in education. We also need to look at the history of, because there was a lot within the stolen generation, that mistrust of anything that would be seen as a government organisation, and certainly, feeling that due to the racism or the discrimination, as you talked about, Tori, because we know it still goes on quite significantly. And some of my ex-students who now I hope I can, talk to as friends, will give me stories even today of the things that can occur for them within this community. And I think it's really important that we listen to those stories and we really take on board, what is happening still, and how can we, assist people with going through that. So I thought about really going through a few statistics, but that's one of those things I'm not great at. But I do need to say that we have probably, seen an increase in digital learning for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and we've also seen that significantly rise within 2018 and 2019. And we've seen the numbers of Aboriginal staff increasing over the years, but we have something like 16 to 17,000 staff within the TAFE system of New South Wales. And of that, we are looking at around about 1.88%, which is such a small percentage compared to the rest of the system. So, encouraging staff to be involved in TAFE, getting Aboriginal people to come in and, you know, aspire to sort of work with our young people within the areas would be just wonderful if we could actually increase on those numbers, because they understand some of the things that are happening. So we also have a review going on at the moment, which I can't sort of release, but looking at Aboriginal support structures within the TAFE system. And some of the key areas were things around Aboriginality, you know, people needing to be not identified, sometimes people feeling, you know, because we need to be really respectful that that's not something that we should be expecting. They're looking at reconciliation. How do we do that? Some of our plan, our RAP plan around reconciliation actually is open for review right up until June. And I think that shows for me that what we're doing is actually really asking people to go in, all the TAFE staff to go in and look at it and review those plans and make comment on them. And what I sort of thought about this morning was we need to make sure that the whole community has access to that and they can also make comment as well, because I think that's incredibly important. And it also looks at Aboriginal employment and retention within the TAFE system, and how do we maintain that? You know, what sort of skills and knowledge and training do the staff that work in TAFE, you know, need to stay upskilled, but also to have value in the jobs they're doing. So being recognised as valued, and often what we've seen in the past, and I know because I've worked in the community a long time, was that, you know, just putting things in place and putting somebody in a position doesn't make them always feel valued. It doesn't always make them feel like what they're doing is important. So I think that's a really big part of what we should be doing when we're looking at Aboriginal employment and retention. And of course, what we see all the time is Aboriginal engagement and delivery, the design of the types of packages we have, the educational support, and then looking at the success that we can get from that in collaboration with our communities. So the other thing that was released by TAFE in 2013, which is a long time ago, was a thing called Not Just a Dream, and it was about young people. So if you get a chance to get your hands on that, you probably can get it from the TAFE system. It actually has stories about students that have come through the system and how it felt for them. So I'm not going to go into all of those, but really important. So it was compiled by TAFE and put together also from the New South Wales Board of Vocational Education and Training. So I can actually send the website through if anybody wants to have a look at that. So overall, some of the barriers that I looked at was financial, and it's not about having free courses. It's about what people can afford. Can they get to TAFE? Can they afford to have the resources in those classrooms? Can they afford to take the time out from their families, because sometimes they are very important in the livelihood of their families and very supportive of their families. There's still so much mistrust within the Aboriginal communities, and I know within this area that's so true. And again, just breaking down that, you know, the lack of educational opportunities that have occurred due to the history that's been experienced, lack of self-esteem and confidence, discrimination, which we know still goes on, and biggest of all, as Paul pointed out before, is literacy. So that English is not always the second language, not just for the person, but their families as well. So getting the concepts around assessments and getting it around what we're presenting and teaching can be really difficult. And often that lack of motivation. So for all the reasons above, often what we see is that lack of motivation to actually do any more education at school, because their first experiences were not always positive. So we need to be really, and we can become ambivalent and not want to be involved in something that we felt wasn't a positive experience in our life. So that's really important to take on board. When I was asked to do this, I thought, you know, I'm not the expert here, and I'm certainly could tell stories from my background, but this is not about me today. This is about the community in which I work. So what I wanted to do was bring a couple of ex-students of mine who are doing extremely well. One now working in health as a mental health worker, another who works with an Aboriginal service within the area, and he works with men's groups. So working around domestic family violence, drug and alcohol issues and things like that. And it was a really lovely time to sort of sit and just have a yarn with them about, you know, how they saw TAFE for them. They both finished their courses, which was really great. And Kelvin Jarrett is one of the people that I spoke to, and he said I could use his name today. So he talked about, you know, what he found at TAFE was being supported and encouraged by not just the teachers, but also the students in the classes. So he found people to be non-judgmental. He also looked at how people were encouraged to speak openly in the environment and in a cultural context too. So often what we can do, you know, because we really lack Aboriginal teachers within our system. And one of the things that a lot of us who do facilitate courses for Aboriginal students, we will often invite elders and members of the community to come in and talk about their community. And I think that is one way of not just empowering the students that are there, but also empowering some of the white students within our classes to get a better understanding of the history. And I think that's important. That actually brings people together. And he talked about teachers being willing to learn and openly admitting to not being the experts and other students not being judgmental. He talked about, he found it was a positive, safe space for him, and that people empathised rather than sympathised with student stories. So that was really positive. Facilitated students talking about their communities, shared responsibilities. There was a very big emphasis on Aboriginal speakers and face-to-face interaction. So I do want to acknowledge that was some really good points from both men who I spoke to. So some of the negatives that they talked about, and I want to say some of the things we need to improve, because I don't like the word negative, but, you know, lack of appropriate support if there's no connection, that they won't feel supported, and better understanding of when life happens. So we know within our communities there are lots of issues that go on, and he felt that people needed to have a better understanding of things like Sorry Day, and when things happen in family, that families come together, and that can have an influence on how they're going at TAFE. Negative comments from mainstream and Aboriginal students that could cause conflict within areas. But he also talked about some of the courses being imposed on students that don't, and that we need to ask students what they really want to do, where are their interests, what are they doing, and having a better understanding of the pathways to employment and support within their own communities. And the unrealistic timeframe. So what we've found is that we're delivering courses in very short times and over a period of, say, 3 terms to do a certificate for, say. What we've had to do often is extend, and that's not because somebody's not good at what they're doing, because everybody has their skills, but it takes time to go through that process, and we need to understand that and give that extra time. Again, the stigma, the literacy, and more language. So Mirabai within the Nambucca Valley does do a lot of work with Maxwell TAFE around language classes, but also students are encouraged to go. And the mental health issues, so being unmotivated and ambivalent due to the abuse. So I know I'm probably trying not to go over time here, Tori. So just a few little positive strategies that I sort of put together was we need to define the cultural need and issues within our own areas, as well as the bigger picture. We need to look at what does the student really want and the individual needs. So not putting people in the same, you know, box, I suppose, being inclusive, the strengths and interests of each person being acknowledged, and stop worrying about the journey's end, but how do they want to get there? How do they want to do it? And we need to look at the language used when we're writing our assessments and be more flexible and more inclusive. And biggest of all is providing that safe environment. And we need to, above all, consult and collaborate with our communities on a major level. They need to be telling us what is needed, and they need to be very much a big part of it. And I think, you know, when we look at inclusion, we need to think about, you know, if we're wanting to look at inclusion for everybody within the TAFE system, we need to be looking at how people are viewed, you know, and we need to make sure that they're seen as capable and valued contributors, as opposed to having deficits that need to be fixed. We need to be looking at human diversity, where each person is viewed as the individual. So probably it is everybody's responsibility. But sometimes our fears and our lack of confidence and our attitudes and our beliefs, you know, can make this a really significant barrier to achieving inclusion. And we need to be really good at reflecting, or having good reflective practice to think about how we're doing things, what's not working. And as educators, we need to be committed, and we need to work as a team. And that's the first starting point for us as teachers. So probably, it's probably all I need to present, because I think you've probably run out of time, and I can talk a long time, let me tell you, I'm a teacher. So I think I feel really, really valued in being asked to be here today, and I thank you. And I actually want to thank First People's Disability Network, because they've often helped in my classrooms as well. So thank you very much for that as well. So that's me, Tori.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Julian. We do appreciate you being able to take the time and, you know, share your experience and the experience of your students as well. I think, you know, like, it's good to hear that, you know, some of the good news stories coming through. I think that's really, really encouraging, you know, particularly that student that you spoke of, Melvin. And I think you touched on a lot of good points as well, like in particular the individualised kind of approach to learning, and also, I guess, you know, just institutions being aware of culturally significant days and events. You know, life does happen, and sometimes for our people, things like sorry business and that, you know, it could be a week, and it could be even longer. And I think, you know, consideration around that is, I think, important to see our people, you know, continue to proceed, and I guess the gap being closed, especially in the education system, which what you're talking to today. So yeah, thank you again, Julie, for your time. Just got a comment from Kay Sadler. Oh, hey, Annie Kay, hope you're well. She's said there's still no follow through the system as support for learning. My son is 33 and had no support as promised, and in TAFE as well. Any sort of advice you could give Annie Kay there, Julie?
Yeah, look, I would probably be contacting some of the Aboriginal specialists within our units at TAFE and having a chat to them, and you know, they can have a talk about and listen, because one of the biggest things that we need to learn to do so well, because, you know, many people in our Aboriginal communities are the best storytellers in the world, and the people that know how to listen the most are sometimes those Aboriginal specialist workers or community workers who can actually sit and listen. And I think that's the most important thing. Don't give up, just keep plugging away. And I think, you know, that's what I want to see, is I want people to build a motivation to actually go back and again and keep moving, because the more, you know, I've always said we need feedback. We need to hear back from people about how it is for them, because we can't fix anything that's going wrong or anything in our system if we're not listening to what people want to tell us. And, you know, it's no good sort of saying, yep, we do feedbacks, but we need to really listen to that. And I think that the first start is to actually go through to talk to somebody you feel safe and that you feel is really going to listen to you. So hopefully that will help.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Well, I was also interested too, you know, the point you made before COVID, from, I think you said since 2018, you'd seen an increase in Aboriginal students engaging online.
Yeah.
What's that looking like? Is that more of, are you seeing more success rates online than in classroom, or?
So I couldn't tell you what the success rate is. I think the numbers are higher. So again, you know, that's probably something we need to look at and investigate and see is it just about numbers, or are we getting outcomes? And what sort of outcomes have we got? When I was looking at, you know, because what I find a lot of the students, because I am teaching online at the moment, and I've got a number of young Aboriginal people in my classes, and what I'm finding is they don't mind the online, but we're also building in one-on-one online. So a bit, not Zoom, because we use another media area, but the face-to-face stuff is so important because of the body language and the types of things that we can get across through our tone of voice and our body language and things like that. So they're really, and I think Paul talked about that, signs and things like that that you look for. And I think I'm also setting up now to have one-on-one with students in our campus. We can't have big classes, but we can set up one-on-one. So I've already booked in a couple of people because that online system, it doesn't, when they're coming into the classroom, they're seeing you and they're getting a chance to talk to you before or after class. And I think that we need to be really careful that we are minimising or maximising the time that they've got outside of the class. So how we do it at the moment is 9:30 till 12:30 is just delivery of whatever unit I'm teaching, be it mental health or domestic family violence. And then from 1 till 3, my students can, you know, join me in a one-on-one online. And I find that's working, because what I've asked each time is, this working for you, or do we need to meet in campus? Because we can. Because we also need to be really aware of the vulnerability of our community. Should we be meeting on campus and not be sticking to all the different rules around COVID as well? Because we don't want to be causing more hardship within our communities through something that's, you know, can be devastating. So I don't know whether I answered your question then, Tori, but yeah, I think we need to wait and see what the outcomes are like and whether people are getting best outcomes and what the numbers are looking like. And I might look into that. So around the digital.
Yeah, no, well, it sounds like from what you're saying, it seems to be a good way to engage people. And I think, you know, the more options people have, the more sort of confident they're going to be in, you know, how they actually approach their own learning.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, once again, I just want to take the opportunity to thank yourself, Julie, for coming on and sharing about the education system and your experience in that area, and also Uncle Paul for sharing your work with us and everything that you do. We love your work. And also Linda Finucane for coming on as our Auslan interpreter. So guys, with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. We're a bit over 2 p.m. here, but I just want to encourage you, just keep an eye out for the next webinar, same time next Wednesday, where we're going to have 2 female advocates come on board and talk about their experiences and their sort of, I guess, struggle and wins as women with disability. So thanks again, guys. Stay safe out there and take all the necessary precautions to keep yourself and your family well. And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, Tori. Well, and thank you. See you, Julie. See you, Linda.
Bye, Paul. Bye, Linda.